Welcome everybody, welcome back to the Creation Station. I've been so busy through pandemic year number 2, which is unbelievable in and of itself. But I just completed a project that took me and my client and co-producer, Jimmy Dunn, a good long time to complete because it was creating a music library for Pepperdine University. And I want to show you today the one of the most outstanding pieces, and unusual pieces to record in a studio environment like this, which is the Pepperdine Fight Song in a marching band setting with full choir and audience singing along. That is something that takes a while to put together, and I wanted to show you real quick what the steps were that we took to get to this. First of all, I want to play you just a little bit. Here's the result as you can hear it on YouTube. Let's go through the sequence as to how this whole thing came about. Here's just a simple little piano layout that sort of defines the chord structure. First thing that I laid down after I had the piano was the outline of a drum arrangement. Superior drummer with 5 different snare drums. That's our main drums, the marching drums. So you can tell that they all have different pitches. If you now play them all together, they sound like a quite kind of massive group rather than having snare drums that are all in similar pitches. So I deliberately chose different snare drums because in marching bands you often see that the snare drums are not uniform in size. That's why the pitches are also different. Let's just play a little bit just on the snare drums alone. And you can hear that these are MIDI notes that were committed to audio. Those are quantized very, very loosely. So I wanted to make sure that nothing sounded mechanical. Because believe me, when you're in the field and the marching band director lays the rhythm down, what's going to come from the different edges of the field is going to be quite a variety of downbeats. You know, that makes the marching band so interesting because it's this body of sound, but it's not all mechanical and narrow, you know, in its rhythmic definition. So next up, we have the piatti, you know, good old orchestral cymbals. Let's move on. Low drums are next. These are the low drums that give it the girth, you know, the depth of field, so to speak. Those are extra low. They're actually orchestral gran casas here. So they got a lot of punch to them, and they actually, most of the marching band drums I've seen, especially the low-end drums, are not necessarily that low in tuning. Military snare drum is also in there. Then we have something called the anti-drums, and the anti-drums are in the middle section, which I call the cheerleader section, as described earlier. Now this is a very aggressive and processed rock or funk drum kit, which I thought was a cool thing to use in this song because a lot of the more evolved marching bands, such as Ohio State, they have sometimes supplemental instruments. But there's a few big bands, actually, that have a stage set up on the side where there's bass, drums, keyboards, singers, the whole 9 yards. Like a whole band added to a marching band in order to just open the spectrum up for new ideas. So this, in that section, we also have claps. Nice, aggressive gospel claps. Something called a murder toms. And those are not easy to record in the field, believe me. Rototoms. Then we have the apocalypse tambourine. It's like a very wildly overstated tambourine. So if you now look at this entire thing, wait, there's one more thing. It's the Gran Casa. There's one roll on the Gran Casa, which I love. You know, that's a beautiful lifter. It's just a dynamic lift into like a section or a climax. So if you listen to this whole thing together, you get sort of an image like this. And while we are there, let me also explain to a real important thing about these two left faders here. This is fader number 2 and fader number 1. Those are what I call auralizations. These are convolution reverbs whose job it is nothing other than simulate depth of field and convolute the signal. That's why they're called convolution reverbs. Which means that, let's say you had a snare drum standing far out in the field and recorded it with a microphone standing over here, where you are. Then the sound of that snare drum would bounce off all sorts of the floor, all sorts of things that are around this snare drum, like whatever reflections can be generated, and then bounce back at you. But it will very rarely be the naked signal only. You can't hear the naked signal. You hear thousands of reflections, which are, I'll use the word convolutions for that. So the signal is convoluted with reflections around it. That's why the sound is so incredibly fat, but also gives you the ear the clear idea that this is a signal that's further away. So in order to accomplish that, I created a track here that you can see called Percussion Auralize. There is an IR1L in here. It's a very light version of a Waves plugin. There's a concert hall setting. The IR is called concert hall with a length of 1.4 seconds. That was just enough to create like a natural throw around the instruments without sounding like an outright reverb. So let me turn that back on and then play with the settings a little bit so you can hear what that does to the sound. Here we go. Let me go back a little bit. Now let me just bring it down. So once you bring it down, you realize, okay, it gets clearer, but it sounds more like a studio recording then. I just searched very long to find the right convolution that brought back enough stuff, enough grain of the recording to make it appear that we're in open spaces. I could have actually, you could see I'm using it here, hovering around the value of, -5 or -7. But if you bring it up to almost to, you could bring it up to 0. It still sound good. Look. So there's a lot of heft that comes in from that particular plugin. So let's move on up. Next chapter is no longer, you heard the drums now. I forgot two tracks, so sorry. There's 2 tracks that belong to this whole thing, which I got from the Spitfire Marching Band. It's called Drumline. It's very useful samples that use these high, almost papery kind of sounding snare drums and a tonal version of the marching bass drum. So now let me turn everything on again so we can hear what all of that sounds like. So doesn't that sound incredibly loose? And we think, okay, now guys, you could be just a little tighter. In context, you'll see it works exactly right. That's the astounding thing. Sometimes the mass of the track as the instrument comes on top of instrument, you realize, oh, that feels exactly right. You know, because when you played it, when you heard it in the first time around, when I played you the recording, you were able to hear, said, yep, that sounds like a marching band. Reason why that's so loose is so that you get the idea of what it feels like when you have live musicians in front of you on a field that stand like sometimes 50, 60 yards away from each other. So anyways, that was the rhythm section. Now let me move up to the brass. First of all, we got woodwinds and brass in here. We got piccolo in here. So that's the core melody. Next up, right above that, I'm just going to go up the session here as it moves on the screen. Next up is tuba. A very, very brassy one. The next tuba is warmer. And there's a reason behind this. There's a reason why I took that softer sound, this one, and then this brassy one on top. Because when an instrument has that much brass and treble frequencies on it, it's a clear indicator that it stands somewhat closer to you than the other darker one. There's brass over here as well. The brass group does this. So that's basically the low end is covered. What I also added on top of that in order to have a real perception of not just the brassiness of the sound, but the root of that note, which is far lower than the brassy sound ever reaches, I added a bass synthesizer. That has a lot of definition. Alone by itself, it sounds just very simple. It sounds like this. That's the entire purpose of it, is to establish the root of that note. In context with all that big percussion on it, it seemed necessary. Next up, as we're moving into the chordal realm now, that's the chordal fundament of the whole song. That's the supportive, thick brass chordal substructure that it needs. Next, I created several monophonic tracks from plugins such as trombone and trumpet and solo tuba. Bone number 1, bone number 2, trumpet 3, trumpet 2. You see they have slightly different pan positions and slightly different sound because these are different instruments. And what else have we? Bass trombone is in here. That's chordal. Bass trombone number 2. Just to get as much smack as possible. Then there's chordal brass on top of this. Those are in staccatissimo. And those are legato. That's the entire amount, the entire brass section that's here. Let me play this to you with all the bass horns. Let's see what that sounds like. Here we go. Let me stop and now turn the auralization on. The auralization is very interesting. It's an altiverb with a setting called street. Now let me turn this on and then exaggerate a little bit. So you can see like it got too much at some point, but all the way up to zero, what was it? Yeah. All the way up till about 0 dB, it felt okay. I thought, yeah, there's some more life coming from it. You don't want mud. If the plugin brings life, that's good. If it brings mud, that's not good. So now let me bring the plugin down and make it just drier. So now the instrument lack early reflections around them, and that's why convolutions plugins are so incredible. They give you just a lot of early reflections. It's the early events, not the reverb, that is as much important in a convolution reverb. Let me play you just a little bit when what all of that sounds together without any vocal involvement. Here we go. Then my dear client Jimmy decided to ask me if it would make sense if we would now get to the recording of additional instruments, such as live instruments. So I asked my friend Paul Knoll and his great friend Crystal on trumpet to join me here in the studio behind me on one lollipop mic. It was an Audix lollipop and a Crowley Trip ribbon to record a few tracks and layers of this composition, of this arrangement, and overdub them. And here's just a couple of examples. And that, of course, adds to the realism like crazy. And let me take a look. That's all trombone stuff up here. Excuse me for the scroll. The scrolling is never easy with Pro Tools. Let me go and now bring in Crystal on trumpet. Wonderful trumpet player. So obviously mixing those in with the synthesized trumpet totally took all the syntheticness out of it. And so let me just turn this off. And now when you hear this, and I hope you're listening on headphones, then you will hear not only that there are things here and there, but there are things here and even here. You know, there are things in the depth of the field, and they're deliberately placed there with convolution reverbs and other means, sometimes even using an EQ, make them a little duller, or compressing them stronger. Then let's move on to the vocals. This is the Pepperdine Choir. I call it the Peppy Choir. And here's what they sound like by themselves.
We're gonna fight, fight, fight for Pepperdine. We're gonna win for the orange and the blue.
All right, so that's them. Now let's add the very first thing I recorded, which was my own voice. It's kind of laugh now when I hear it. I tried to pretend to be 8 different people. I added my own voice to it, and it ended up sounding, you know, okay, we're getting closer. Next person in this mix here is my friend Johnny Schaefer.
We're gonna fight, fight, fight.
The next person in the lineup was my dear friend and long time stage and studio companion, Sue Holder.
Gonna fight, fight, fight for Pepperdine.
And we have 8 tracks of her. Next up is my dear client, Jimmy Dunn, putting a nice baritone track on it.
We're gonna fight, fight, fight for Pepperdine.
And it sounded good to pan him just in the middle. Some of the outlier voices are better panned outside. So Jimmy's in the center. And then his friend, a wonderful young singer named Bella, added her lovely voice to it.
We're gonna fight, fight, fight for Pepperdine.
So she just had it even sang a little bit more legato. But of course that makes sense because people in a stadium would never sing in such sync as studio singers would, you know. So vocals. Let's see, can I mute the track?
We're gonna win for the orange and the blue. The mountains and the sea inspire victory in the waves of Malibu.
That's pretty much the entire ingredient of this song. It's only brass instruments, percussion instruments, and vocals. Okay, let's turn it all back on together for just one brief second. Let me go to the ending this time. We're starting in the middle section. Oh, I'm so sorry to interrupt. I wanted to point out one more thing to you, one instrument I forgot to introduce, and that's the set of clarinets. There's 2 tracks of clarinets in here, and they play this cool little syncopated riff before the middle section and after the middle section. Here's what they do. Clarinet 1, and clarinet number 2. So slightly different in phrasing, and excuse me for the glitches here in playing back with scrolling. But those are really, really important. Look what they do, the excitement that they bring. When I set out to do a recording to emulate a live body of people and of musical instruments like this, I'm going to have to teach my ears exactly what they sound like when they're out in a distance versus when they're close up. So what I did is for weeks before I even put the first note down, or when I made the first little samples and got the instruments lined up, I listened to many, many, many marching bands, probably about 100 all in all, and of good recordings, and didn't find too many because it's a very, very tricky instrument to record. So the training that I needed to do for this took weeks, and it took weeks to put this together with constant going back and forth with the arrangement that Jimmy Dunn and I have created. But we're really proud of it now because it's the best representation of how this song could sound when it's played by a full-blown marching band with the audience singing along. You know, so that's the purpose of this video, is just to go through how that musically was put together. I just want to take one quick second to talk about the engineering aspect when you mix these things together. I did an extraordinary amount of processing on this thing. This is very compressed, but never to the point that it sounds smashed. So first I want to show you real quick what's in the master bus. I always have a separate track bus and a separate vocal bus. Here is the vocal master. Here's the track master. Let me show you what's in the track master. Here's the Abbey Road vinyl plugin, which I love because it just reorganizes the sound like an analog instrument would. It's just really wonderful. Didn't use any of the noise. Didn't use any of the crackle. I just used only its I don't know how you want to call that, convolution. It does a convolution with the sound that happens. You know, the molecules of stuff are being reorganized as you speak, because when you turn it off, it sounds very, very different. I'm not going to go into that for now. Next up is this compressor here, the Shadow Hills mastering grade compressor from Brainworks, which I think is absolutely incredible. You know, for example, it provides so much glue. I want to just give you that one example here. So you can see here the optical stage of this plugin isn't even very active. It's engaged. But the compressor over here in the discrete section, it's like basically two plugins in one. The second one does a maximum of 1 decibel of compression. That's not a lot. But if I turn it off, check this out. Now with the plugin in. One more time without. Back on. It's just the whole sound steps forward, but it steps forward subtly, but so that you want to keep it in. The moment you turn it off, you're like, oh, it's a little bit of a letdown. So that's a fantastic plugin. Next one is a dedicated EQ. We've got some ringing frequencies that needed to be notched out. Same thing with this is an automated EQ. I have a clipper in there in order to get more gain and less transients, because samples have quite a bit of nasty transients that need to be tamed. That's pretty much in the master bus. That's of the track. And then the vocal bus has very similar ingredients in it. A de-esser for the entire group. The same compressor. Again, the look, very, very strong high pass on it, because when people sing in a stadium and they're far away from you, they don't bring any bass. They're sort of more like in a 800 or 600, as low maybe as 500 or so, but not much lower than that. You're not going to hear much from them. That's pretty just the nature of having people at a distance or instruments at a distance. They can't transmit so much bass. What else is in here? Just an automated one-band EQ, nothing else. This whole thing, these two tracks, go into the actual output. This is my master bus. So there is the lovely Beatles compressor in here. I love this, the Abbey Road compressor, the RS124. And also want to show you what happens if I turn that off. Let's go back to this section. Let me turn the vocals off so you can hear it a little bit clearer. Turning it off. Turning it back on. It just fills in excitement, and as you can see here in the mix button, it's only about 25% that have it on. So this is clearly parallel compression. But, you saw here in the meter, that's easily 15 decibels of compression. So there's a lot going on. This is being used quite strongly. Master EQ, this is an old trick. Boosting frequencies and ducking them tunes everything downward, so you get more sub and more heft in the low department, the really low lows, fundamentals. I'm doing the slight boost, 1.4 at around about 16 kilohertz over here. Nothing much than that. There's another Pro Q on it where I'm doing a little, you could see I'm raising a little bit on the mid-range. This is actually a setting I learned from my audiophile mentor, one of my audiophile mentors, Mark Daniel Nelson. This plugin is really wonderful because I'm just doing a little enhancement here in the mid-range, so you can see a little pulsating going on. So everything just breathes a little bit with the setting. This is very low. Look, it's below. Here's 1 dB. 1 dB would be up here on that line. So there's very little, it's very subtle, but very effective. General EQ, I had to do a little bit of dropping the mid-range here in the center, because this equalizer is so incredibly genius that I can take the mid-band, everything that's center, and drop, for example, muddy mid-range out. That's what this band is for here. And then it's a little stereo lift on the bass, so there's a strong bass raise on this whole thing. Over 3 decibels of top in a stereo, so the sizzle on the sides, left and right, is enhanced. Shadow Hills, for the final stage, doing exactly the same thing, even less of compression. It's just in there, and I'm using a little widening here. It's 103%. And then I got my favorite new limiter on there, the Pro L2. Look how much it's working here. So the apparent loudness of this program is really high, but the limiter is working very little, you know. So that's the entire deal. I hope this was instructive and inspirational for you. Please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel. I do, by the way, I teach on Zoom engineering, orchestration. You can contact me in regards to all these things. There's an email address below. And that's exactly what I'm doing. I, for example, frequently will hire engineers that I deeply respect or producers if they will make themselves available and learn from them online. And then, you know, just pay a couple of hours of getting better at what I do. You know, so I'm willing to do the same thing. We'll just figure out an hourly rate and go from there. I love doing this. I'm very passionate about it. So come to the website, stephanoberhoff.com. And then please stay tuned to the next video. This was, I cannot tell you how much fun it is to see these instruments grow from just a piano over just a few snare drums. And then all of a sudden this thing begins to grow and to get more and more muscle. And you can, at any point, you can say, all right, it's getting muddy now. I need to pull things back out. But it was just, you know, I've done this long enough so that I can just throw the kitchen sink at it and it will still be musical. You know, that is probably one of the most important things I would like to impart with you guys, is that, like, the longer you do this, the safer your choices will become in the sense of what you can throw at it without having to pull things back out and deconstruct too much. You know, so now they have a really stately sounding recording. And on that channel, please also look at the Pepperdine library, which is just brand new released. They have an alma mater that was written by my client, Jimmy Dunn, who's an incredible songwriter, is a very decorated songwriter. We've done so much work together. This is probably one of the things we are most proud of. So please check out the Pepperdine Anthem. I'll put a link in the description below where you can click on it directly. That's pretty much it. All I can tell you is just, you know, like, this pandemic has been an incredibly busy time for me because I've been working remote. I've been working with students in New York, in Brazil, and, you know, even Italy. And I love doing this. And just, you know, use this time to get your tools in shape. You know, may this be of inspiration to you, this whole thing. And God bless for listening and sticking with me here to the end. And thank you so much. Stephan Oberhoff signing out from the Creation Station. Peace and goodbye.